Look, Bashar Assad is a throwaway for Putin. Putin's objectives were very clear. First, it was to get relevancy back in the world stage. I mean, Putin sees the United States as contracting. He sees a vacuum that Russia can fill, and he stepped up and filled it with, let's be honest, with a few, I don't know, I've heard estimates from anywhere from a few billion to $5 billion spent and 50 jets. He lost next to nothing in terms of Russian lives, and he's completed his objectives. He's secured Assad. Assad's not going anywhere. He secured the Russian physical interest in terms of the two bases there, and he's made it clear that Russia is a world player, that if anyone has problems, they can turn to the Russians, and the Russians can step in and be a counter to the United States and the Allies.
So where does this leave the Geneva talks?
I think that going into the Geneva talks, I think it's an interesting thing. The big thing that has not been solved yet is what is going to happen to the rest of Syria. I mean, Assad wants Syria back to its traditional lines. You have the Kurds who want a Kurdish state, and you have the FSA that wants a regime change. And then, of course, you have Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I don't know that any of that is going to be solved. I mean, the reality is that Assad stays where he is, the FSA stays where they are, ISIS stays in Raqqa, and the Kurds stay where they are. So I don't really know what's going to be solved. I mean, peace is something that, unfortunately, millions of refugees want, but no one else seems to have any interest in solving this.
It's been a strange disconnect over the past couple of months. On the one hand, we've seen Russian jets pounding allies of the West in northern Syria, most notably. And on the other, the U.S. and Moscow together trying to get these political talks off the ground.
Well, I think that Putin was very much under the gun to get some resolution here. Look, the price of oil impacts this greatly. When oil is cheap, it makes it very cost-effective to conduct military operations. Flying jets, sailing boats, driving tanks is less costly. I mean, the Russians also had stockpile of old, dumb iron bombs, which is predominantly what they used in this conflict. So when the price of oil was down, it was in Putin's favor to carry out these operations. With the price going up, I think he's looking for a hasty way to get out of this, and he's done that. So I don't know that the U.S. and the Russians were really aligned in bringing this to a close anytime soon. I think the interesting thing here will be what actually happens with those Russian forces. We saw the jets land in Russia. Is it going to actually be the end of offensive capabilities in Syria, or are they going to go to a garrison force? It's not quite clear. I mean, this could just be a planned rotation out. I'm not so sure that Putin is really going to pull out all that much or leave capabilities out of Syria. So I take everything he says with a grain of salt.
All right, skeptical about just how far that pullout goes. And let me ask you about a statement made in the past minutes by the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, saying that the political talks in Geneva, again, talks that have been pushed by both the U.S. and Russia, that these talks may be the best opportunity in years to end the Syria crisis. Do you agree?
You have to have everyone who wants to end this, and I just don't see. Look, all of the players here want land, and I don't see them giving that up. I don't see the FSA laying down its arms and retreating. I don't see the Kurds doing the same, and certainly ISIS isn't going to just abandon its post. So I'm not exactly sure what it is that when we say peace, what it is we're going to solve here, because at the end of the day, the Russians have pulled out, but the situation on the ground is the exact same as it was yesterday.
One final question for you, Naveed. This is taking, we're talking as in the U.S., citizens are voting in several key primaries. What's the long view among voters who are picking the next president of the United States about involvement in the Middle East?
Well, look, the U.S. is coming off of, Afghanistan and Iraq, and I think the people here in the U.S. are tired of war. They're tired of, I mean, you've heard every presidential candidate and the president himself here is saying no to boots on ground. The reality is, unfortunately, to bring peace to a region, you have to use force. And force is not going to happen from bombing from the air, as we've seen with the Russians. It's going to take, unfortunately, boots on the ground. I don't see that there's the appetite for such adventures anymore here in the U.S., and certainly no presidential candidate is advocating such. I mean, they all push for resolution, but they do so in a very limited fashion and with the idea of not entering into protracted conflict.
And when you hear that the U.S. Secretary of State is traveling next week to Moscow?
Obviously, Russia is a key player in the world stage. Why wouldn't he? I think that, I have to give a little bit of shrugging sort of credit to the Russians in that they've really asserted themselves, and unfortunately, the U.S. can no longer act completely unilaterally, and we have to deal with the Russians now. It's just the way the world is now.